This, as you can see, is a co-authored presentation, a paper that I'm writing with Dr. Emily Piney, University of Puget Sound in Washington State. It comes out of a workshop that we held at the University of Chicago in May this year that Gonzalo Paz and about 25 other researchers were involved in, looking at Asia-Latin America food connections and agriculture connections. It's really within the Latin American Studies Association, which Gonzalo used to co-chair, the group for Asia and the Americas that I now co-chair. And if any of you are interested in joining that group or being on our mailing list or being involved in our events, do talk to me, because we'd like to involve more people in it. One of the things we do is we try to educate people and debate the impact of China in Latin America, to try to understand some of the motivations from within China that are having such a strong impact in Latin America. And that's where we begin here, trying to understand a bit about what's going on in China. We know that Premier Li Keqiang has told us we have to rely on domestic consumption. This will require China to import some $10 trillion worth of commodities by 2018. We also know that this is driven largely by urbanization. Further 300 million city dwellers by 2025 will bring the urban population to about 1 billion people. So this is, as I'm sure you've heard, it's the biggest movement of people into cities in the history of humanity. And this is really generating then demand for all sorts of foreign goods and natural resources. You know, if we look at the map of China, we know where the stories about Beijing and Shanghai, those are the famous cases of demand for iron ore, for instance, that has been so important for Australia, for Brazil, copper from Chile. And what's interesting, though, about these big mega cities is that they do reach a saturation point in terms of building and architecture and construction. What never reaches a saturation point, though, is demand for food, right? So we heard yesterday that the iron ore price has dropped to about $85 per ton, the lowest since the GFC, and yet the price of foods, particularly soy, keeps going up. And that's logical, because people need to eat, no matter what their country's macroeconomics looks like. It's also worth pointing out that, the Economist Intelligence Unit likes to come up with catchy acronyms. So it's come up with this acronym of the CHAMPS, C-H-A-M-P-S, to tell us where the demand is going to be coming from in China going forward. Chongqing, Hefei, Anshan, Manshan, and Pingdingshan. So these are small cities at the moment, but they're growing by about 30% every year. And so this is where demand, not just for food, but also iron ore and metals, is going to be coming from for the foreseeable future. The story so far then from China is really one of demand, right? We know that China is expected to import some 90 million tons per year of soybeans and its derivatives by 2030. Premier Wen Jiabao, former Premier Wen Jiabao, said last year that by 2017, China aims to import about $40 billion worth of edible oils and seeds. So these are massive numbers, really underpinning the demand story, right? And this is why we have large Chinese state-owned enterprises going out and investing wherever they can in the world in agricultural production. This last year was pretty momentous, the announcement of a 3 million hectare purchase of land in the Ukraine. Of course, with what's going on in the Ukraine now, it's really uncertain if that's going to go ahead. But what it does demonstrate is the willingness and the capacity of China's SOEs, state-owned enterprises, to go out and put a lot of money into the production of food, right? So the largest SOE in agriculture in China, COFCO, agreed to pay, this is more recently, this is this year, $1.2 billion for a controlling stake of the Dutch grain trader Nidera, and $1.5 billion for a controlling stake of Noble Group. The idea here is to enter into markets to acquire particularly soybeans, right? Markets that are producing soy, but where direct investment from Chinese SOEs may be too politically sensitive to be approved, may stir up all kinds of backlashes, the way we've seen in Australia, and we'll come to the Australian case in a minute. So this is one way to do it without having such a direct, strong face on the ground, right? And it's also another way then of avoiding the big four global grain traders, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. There is another dimension to this that's really important. I can't go into it today, but this is the food safety dimension as well. We know from a number of scandals in China lately, most recently about a month ago, with the production of chicken nuggets, I think, for various fast food chains, that food safety is causing people in China to increase their demand for food from outside of China, produced outside. There are some very interesting niches then that countries like Australia and others can seek to fill. So the food safety thing is really tied into this. We'll see if we can maybe tie that back in a bit later. Look, again, the demand story, right? On the top there, we see that goes up to 2011. That's Chinese soybean production, the bottom line, and consumption, the top line. The difference between the two, the blue area, then is imports. You can see there, imports of about 60 million tons, right? So you take off that 10 of domestic production, and importing about 60 million tons of soybeans in 2011. Then go down to the bottom here. Does this? No. If you go down to the bottom there, you'll see the number is now at about 70 in 2014. Yeah, okay. So about 70 coming in to China, and Brazil, you can see there, is the largest producer in the world at the moment of soybeans. The global total production of soybeans is now at about 281 million tons. You can see that figure here, that's the top line. That's global soybean production. The line underneath is Chinese consumption of soy. It's really what's driven up the global production of soy, and increasingly so. Soy is an outlier, right? Because in the Chinese case, you can see here there are 4 categories of agricultural commodities, and China needs all of them. 3 of them there are along the bottom. China is not importing large amounts of corn, rice, or wheat. It produces those things itself. But soybeans is really the outlier. It's harder to produce, it requires irrigation, it requires climatic conditions that are difficult to come by in China. So for this reason, it's been really fundamental to import a growing amount of soy from around the world. So the flip side of this demand for soy from around the world is the set of constraints that China faces, right? We know that the price of soybeans has exhibited severe spikes in 2011 to 2012, and the price of soybeans doubled just last year from $217 per metric ton in 2006 through to $534. So this is an increasingly expensive agricultural commodity. There are other constraints and risks that come with this. Brazil and Argentina respectively provide 43% and 22% of China's soy imports. So this is massive. This is where most of China's soy is coming from. And as I mentioned, Emily, who I'm working with, she's done very interesting interviews in China and in Brazil on these issues. She interviewed recently Orlando Ribeiro, who's the director of the Division of Agriculture and Basic Products in Brazil's foreign ministry, and he said this to her: the fact that we send 48% of soy to China, it's complicated because you have a clear dependence on one country. When this country decides it doesn't want to buy any more of your soy for whatever reason, you have a problem on your hands. So where is this excess of soy going to go to? Who is going to consume it? Will we inundate the market? Will the price fall? What can be done? Because this dependency is it creates a certain instability. So for the Brazilians then, this fear of overdependency, and for Argentina, is a major concern. And it has led then to a certain amount of public hostility as Chinese state-owned enterprises come into both of those countries, both to buy product and also to look at producing it themselves, right, through the acquisition of land and through the acquisition of processing. We'll come to this issue of processing in a minute. The other point I just want to mention, and I can't go into this now, but mega regional free trade agreements are another constraint. We heard a bit about the Pacific Alliance. Probably the one that could affect China more is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, mainly because of its constraint on the activities of state-owned enterprises. China's not party to the TPP, neither is Brazil. But one of the objectives of the TPP is to limit the activity of state-owned enterprises. So what does that mean if a Chinese SOE wants to invest in Australia, in agriculture, or in anything? Well, it's going to have some hurdles to overcome now that it didn't before, presuming the TPP comes into effect. Those hurdles can, of course, be overcome. This is another paper that Emily and I are writing. Maybe we can touch on that in a minute. Look, another aspect of this really is how China is trying to reduce those constraints and minimize its vulnerability. Really, the strategy in China is to produce more domestically, to become less dependent on foreign markets. So the NDRC, that's the National Development and Reform Commission, says that it is imperative to stick to the principle of basically achieving grain self-sufficiency domestically. So this is the goal, to become less dependent, and hence the fears of people, as we saw in Brazil, that what do you do if the tap turns off and the demand drops? We're stuck. Well, this seems to be a real prospect as China tries to ramp up its own domestic production. It's trying to do that through large-scale irrigation, water conservation, management of rivers, etc. Really, this is investment in technology. But the Inter-American Development Bank sees the problem, and it warns, quote, China's objective is not only to expand the national production of soy, but also to promote the creation and concentration of companies that process soy within China. Here we come to a point that Sean was talking about, right? This looks a lot like the core periphery model, right? This looks a lot like the problem of deindustrialization for Brazil. It already exports a lot of iron ore, now a lot of agricultural products, but what's it doing to process those things, to add value to them? This is now a key problem in Brazil, and it is in Australia too, and in Chile, and most of the countries that export natural resources to China. How can they add some value to these products? And I want to focus a bit on this issue. Before I do, though, we have to say something about the Brazil-China. Probably Sean's already done this, but the bilateral trade until 2013, you can see it's skyrocketed really there over the past decade. It's now at about $84 billion bilateral. The big growth happened during the GFC, which made, at that point, China Brazil's #1 trading partner ahead of the United States, a position it maintains as demand from the US dropped, but increased in Brazil. And what did Brazil increasingly demand? Well, it was soybeans, right? That's what we see. We saw that soy exports to China in the first half of 2013 increased by 45%. That's the export side. If you look at what Brazil is buying back from China, we see that the import sector that grew the most, the category, is agricultural equipment. So that we see the active participation of Chinese firms, not just in buying Brazilian soy, but actively being involved in producing it. The price, as I said, has led to greater production, right? Increased price means greater production, and so we see a 10% increase in the amount of area dedicated to harvesting soy in Brazil. Now look, there's an environmental angle here that we could take. I'm going to kind of skip through it because I've not got a lot of time. But the UN recognizes the environmental problem. We know that indigenous communities in Brazil are the ones most affected by this. We know that there's contamination of streams through pesticides, of large-scale agribusiness. These are the environmental issues. And as a result, Brazil has revived what it used to have. That's a land registry system that's enabled it to put limits on foreign ownership of land at 25% of any property. We can see it visually here. The sort of orangey area there is the new focal point of soy production in Brazil. It's the Cerrado savanna, not the Amazon, which the Brazilian government has taken measures to limit. It doesn't permit the deforestation of the Amazon anymore, officially. Right? We all know unofficially it happens, but this is then where the soy production is being pushed to. Now, this issue of adding value, right? The top two lines are the important ones there. What we see is that Brazil is producing more soy, that's the top line, and the second top line, the one underneath it, is China's ability to process soy onshore within China, right? So we see that the raw soybeans arriving in China, then being turned into soy oil. This is where the value is added within China. And this has led to a lot of criticism from within Brazil. They're saying Chinese firms should set up processing. We should set up our own processing, they say, of soy within our own borders, within Brazil. So as a result, the Chinese government noticed this and said, look, we're going to set up a soy processing plant for you in 2012, $2 billion processing complex. But when that announcement was made, when it started to be built, people started looking at it and saying, this is a land grab because it comes with not just the processing center, but a tract of land around it, and we don't want the Chinese government owning land in our country. So for this reason, criticisms of xenophobia, responses from China, for instance, Zhang Dongxiang, who says, quote, public opinion sometimes seems to be against foreign investment, as if it makes local industry less competitive. These are some antiquated ideas, he says. President Rousseff has therefore criticized her own ministers and her public of xenophobia and that this might scare away foreign capital. Another way that China can invest in Brazil that may be less sensitive publicly, but just as important, maybe even more so, is infrastructure. These are photos that Emily has taken. This is from Mato Grosso. This, remarkably, is how China gets its soy from Brazil. And it's remarkable because you would expect for such an important industry that you might have a road that's paved. But no, this is Mato Grosso, and the roads are not paved. Right? This is a major bottleneck, and this is where, consequently, the Chinese government is now, and the Brazilian government with it, looking to invest. Right? It's infrastructure, you can see on the left, waterways, highways, and railroad. During Xi Jinping's latest visit 2 months ago to Brazil, as Sean was saying, it's the railroad. You can see in the middle there, these bold lines, right? The bold ones are the planned extensions to what already exists. The thin lines are what already exists. So on the right-hand side there, you can see that horizontal bold line. That's the railroad that now is likely to be built by Chinese firms with Chinese investment. And this is largely a result of this latest trip 2 months ago that this negotiation has been completed. I just want to mention briefly by way of comparison, Argentina has had issues as well with Chinese state-owned enterprises in particularly soy production. Problems so grave that one particular deal in the state of Rio Negro that Gonzalo knows more about than I do was scrapped by the Argentine Congress, and limits on land ownership were placed. And again, just by way of comparison, it is important to see this global issue in a global context. In Australia, we've also seen similar things. The coalition government that we now have has noted what it calls the creeping cumulative acquisition of agricultural land and has proposed limits on foreign investment, particularly from state-owned enterprises. As the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement advances, we've seen this cartoon doing the rounds in the press. You know, the idea that Chinese people are buying up Australian land from people that don't really know what their land is worth. The Lowy Institute poll tells us that 56% of Australians believe that the Australian government is allowing too much investment from China. It does contrast with the facts. We know that only 1% of Australian land is owned by Chinese firms. And if you look at all of Australia's FDI, inbound FDI, only about 4% of it actually comes from China. Compare that to 14% from the UK, 24% from the United States, and yet we don't see these kinds of cartoons. It, again, raises issues about xenophobia, about cultural understandings, about misunderstandings, about lack of education, I'd say principally. It also really indicates where the most likely areas of inbound investment are going to be as we try to open up the Northern Territory to provide food to Asia. Where that's going to be is towards the right-hand side of the agriculture food chain. Right? This is a less sensitive way to do it, and there's a dire need for this in Australia. Again, this ties in with the food safety issues, right? We're looking at investment in high quality and safe, fresh products in Australia that won't require the purchase of large amounts of land. This is something that Brazil is also looking at, how to steer that investment into higher value adding. And as I finish to the end of this race that I've gone through here, I just want to say something about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Again, as I mentioned, this is a nascent agreement which involves 12 countries, the United States, Australia, both members, Chile, Mexico and Peru are members of it. China is not, but one of the key objectives is to limit investment from SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And you look around the world, what are the most active SOEs out there at the moment? They are Chinese ones. So it's no surprise then that the Chinese government has come up with a series of countermeasures, including signing FTAs with Australia and others that can carve out exemptions to TPP provisions to allow SOE investments. Also to do things like channel investment through private firms. We've seen this in the Ord Valley in Australia. We don't know if those firms are actually receiving subsidies from the Chinese government. This is a key area that I think we need to be looking at in our research. And acquisition of existing transnational corporations. As I mentioned, Nidera and Noble Group. So I'm going to finish just with, very briefly, 3 questions that I think are of mutual concern to Brazil and Australia. Does the entry of Chinese and other state enterprises carry unique implications for national food security? How do the priorities of SOEs differ, or are they similar to private firms? Secondly, as Chinese firms seek access to arable land, how can producers ensure that their outputs go to competing markets? There is the problem that if an SOE comes and produces sugar in Australia or in Brazil, right, or soy for that matter, it could send those products at a deflated, below market price back home. And if it does that, then it avoids paying income tax because it's not making any money, a form of profit shifting. We'll see if Joe Hockey really is serious about cracking down on profit shifting. This would be a good example. And then finally, as I mentioned with the TPP, how might restrictions on foreign land titles impact present and future FTAs, right? The Trans-Pacific Partnership is supposed to open up investment from other countries, but if those other countries have SOEs, as China does, then how can the two match together? I speak to people in Canberra about this, people involved in the TPP negotiations, and they tell me they don't know. They could just be saying that, but I don't think they do, actually. I think this is a really interesting area, probably an area that those of us who work on these kinds of issues can provide some useful advice to our policymakers on. And so I think that's part of our role and part of the reason we have conferences like this. So I'll finish there. If you're interested in more, those are 2 articles that have a bit more detail. I think we have a few minutes for questions, right? So I'll end there. Thanks. I think that many Latin American countries share the same problem that Australia does. It's how to bring in investment that's going to be beneficial for the nation, right? And so the obvious way to do it is to try to bring investment into sectors that are going to add value. So this is where negotiating free trade agreements is really important. And I think drawing on the last question here in food, building up, in the case of soy, or in the case of Australia, abattoirs, right, and sugar processing plants that have been part of our negotiations with China. This is actually probably what we need to do, because it gets away from the dependency on such basic products. It adds some value, it adds some technology, it adds some expertise to our economy, to the Brazilian economy, and this way, I think that is the objective. How you get to that objective is a political process. So your question of what role for government, it's twofold. One is to negotiate those terms, in this case with China, that Chinese investment, if it's seeking entry, it should be willing to support those higher value-adding projects. And then secondly, to create the conditions within the country that those higher value-adding segments of the value chain are functional, right? So in the case of Australia, making sure there is something of a food canning industry, that there is something of a processing industry already, that it doesn't have to be built up from scratch. This is a question of industrial policy. And I think government has a strong part to play in this.